All right, it is 1 o'clock, so I'll call the Council Priorities Committee meeting of May the 27th to order and ask for an approval and receipt of the agenda items. Councillor Arneson, seconded by Councillor Kunst. Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. There's Councillor Woodward. And so we only have one item on the agenda, and that is, and it's an item for discussion, which is referred to the Council Priorities meeting from the March the 11th meeting of 2019 in the afternoon, and it is cannabis retail. So, Mr. Bakken, I guess we'll hand it over to you and staff and see what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we do have a bit of a staff overview and presentation here. Mr. Suffy can introduce Mr. Chu, and we can get this moving. So,
Mr. Chair, as Mr. Bakken referenced, Mr. Chu is here to provide the presentation, supported by one of our brains behind the scenes, Michaela Roberts, one of our new staff, and we thought we should not expose her to council at this stage, other than just allowing her to observe more than anything and provide support, as I said, support role to Mr. Chu.
And with that, we'll wish good luck to Mr. Chu. May the force be with you.
Mr. Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned earlier, the focus of our discussion today is on cannabis retail and production. Just very quickly, in this presentation, we'll go over some background information and outline the legislative framework for cannabis retail and production. We'll also look at policy options for cannabis retail and production based on a scan of local jurisdictions and their approaches to regulation. And finally, we'll also talk about ways to regulate other related uses. So back in October last year, cannabis was legalized in Canada. And at the beginning of this year, as Mr. Chair, you mentioned earlier, on March 11th, Council referred a motion for a discussion on cannabis to this particular committee. So very quickly, in terms of legislative framework, at the federal level, the Cannabis Act and associated regulations control activities such as production, licensing, and health and safety issues of cannabis. The health and safety standards include the control of odor. Provincially, regulations dictate the wholesale and retail model, as well as production in the ALR, Agricultural Land Reserve. And regionally, Metro Vancouver has jurisdiction over air quality. Metro Vancouver is currently pursuing regulation of odor in relation to cannabis production and processing. At the municipal level, we can regulate cannabis using zoning and business licensing. Also, as a regulated municipality, the township can pass farm bylaws to regulate cannabis production in the ALR, subject to the approval of the Minister of Agriculture. So this is, in a nutshell, our legislative or regulatory framework. Now, in terms of retail, local governments can place restrictions on the location of cannabis retail stores through zoning bylaws. I mentioned that earlier, but just wanted to point out specifically in terms of our regulatory power. We can also impose terms and conditions as part of business licensing, including signage and hours of operation. We can also charge an application fee. Now, very quickly, we conducted a scan of local governments in the area. Out of 18 local governments, 9 currently allow retail sales, and obviously those are shown in green. 6 do not allow retail, and they're shown in red, and 3 of them intend to adopt policies that will allow some retail sales, and those are shown in yellow. Maple Ridge is the only neighboring municipality that currently allow retail sales. Based on widespread community support, Abbotsford Council is considering 4 initial licenses in the community. So these are retail licenses, retail stores. Here are some of our retail options. If we're considering permitting retail sales of cannabis, and if the consideration is a no, so it's on the left-hand side of the screen, we have 2 options. One is basically do not amend the zoning bylaw, and we would not respond to any application referrals from the BC Liquor and Cannabis Retail Branch, Regulation Branch. So that's one option under no. Alternatively, the zoning bylaw can be amended to make clear that cannabis retail sales are not permitted, and that's the other oval under no. Now, on the other side of the thinking, in terms of options, if we were to consider retail sales, the first option is to create a new zone, so that would require an amendment to the zoning bylaw. And one could argue that council can have more control over the application. The second option is to amend the zoning bylaw to permit cannabis retail sales in existing zones. Generally, we are thinking about commercial zones or areas near commercial areas. And the third option is to require site-specific rezoning in some of the designated areas within the township, and these areas are likely having a commercial designation. There are other considerations. They're at the top right corner. One is to permit private or public retail stores, or permit both private and public at the same time. The public stores are generally ones like the liquor stores, operated by the Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch. We have some examples out there. Maple Ridge and Burnaby are only permitting public stores or in favor of public stores in their policies. Other considerations is to permit a limited or fixed number of stores in the municipality. White Rock is an example. It is permitting only one store in its town center, so it's very specific, one license in the town center, so meaning commercially designated area. Burnaby is permitting 4 public stores, 1 in each of its center, and Port Moody is permitting up to 5 stores in the first year, so there's a range of things that other municipalities are considering. Currently, the zoning bylaw, the township's zoning bylaw excludes medical cannabis as a commercial retail use. Non-medical or recreation retailers require approval from the local government to obtain a license from the province. There are other considerations. One thing that we could consider is to follow the model of an existing policy, and that's the liquor licensing. Under this particular policy, we can, consider public consultation requirements, location criteria, and business licensing requirements. So under public consultation, the liquor licensing policy requires rezoning. It's almost like a public hearing process. It also requires mail out of notices, newspaper notices, and other requirements. In relation to location, council can require setbacks from uses such as schools and playgrounds, setbacks from other cannabis retail stores so that we're not clustering all the stores in one place. And also screening hedges could be used to buffer from residential uses. As a requirement of business licensing, council could require a community impact statement, security requirements, and signage related to smoking laws. So moving on to production. Cannabis production in any form is considered a farm use by the Agricultural Land Commission. Cannabis production in the ALR cannot be prohibited if it is produced as a field crop and produced inside a structure with a base consisting entirely of soil, produced inside a structure built for the growing of crops before July 13th of last year, produced inside a structure under construction as of July 13th of last year for the growing of crops. Now, we have underlined the word crops for a specific reason. If we issued a building permit for a poultry barn, for example, that cannot be converted into a cannabis production facility. So it's purely crop-based. Cannabis production in the form of things other than the ones I've just outlined above may be prohibited by the township. This is more specifically based on our recent correspondence from the Ministry of Agriculture. We have the ability to regulate new cement bottom structures. As I mentioned there earlier, as a regulated municipality, we can actually regulate cannabis production through a farm bylaw. And finally, we can prohibit or regulate cannabis production in urban areas. So there's a differentiation between urban and rural. The treatment could be different in the township. So just like on the retail side, we decided to have a diagram here for us to basically talk about the options, the policy options that we have. On the right-hand side, if we were to consider cannabis production in the urban areas, in this case we decided to use industrial areas as an example because it's a production activity. So we have a choice of either permit or not to permit cannabis production in the urban areas by way of zoning. On the other hand, in the rural side, the ALR side, we can permit all forms of cannabis production, including the bunker type of production facilities, or we can only permit soil-based and existing facilities that are out there or facilities that were converted from other agricultural production to cannabis production. In either option, we'll have to develop a farm bylaw, which we will have to send to the Minister of Agriculture for approval.
Mr. Chu?
Yes.
I should have asked earlier, because it is a discussion, whether you would take questions as we go. Are you almost?
I'm almost towards the end of the presentation.
Okay,
and I can always come back to these slides later on.
Okay, that's what we'll do then. We'll let you finish and then we'll go back. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of other related uses, and we call these non-production activities, and in this case we're looking at activities in the urban areas. So in addition to production, we have processing, research and development, and consumption. Council has the ability to prohibit these uses by amending the zoning bylaw, as I had mentioned earlier. Several local governments permit bunker-style production in industrial areas, and Council recently considered an application in Gloucester for such uses. Permitting production in industrial areas may relieve pressures on the agricultural land reserve. Propagation methods and micro-cultivation may also be better suited to bunker-style production potentially sited in these areas. Large-scale processing is really an industrial use. This would involve drying, packaging, the extraction of oil, and production of edible products. Processing is permitted in the ALR if up to 50% of the product comes from the farm. But servicing for larger scale processing is found in urban areas. Research and development and quality control testing could also be cited in industrial areas. There is already a lab in North Langley that's been doing that for quite some time. And finally, cannabis lounges and spas exist in some communities, although they are not yet legal. Provincial legislation could be coming in the future. Switching gears again a little bit. Production activities in the ALR. Storing, packing, preparing, and processing of cannabis are considered a farm use. Structures necessary for carrying out this use, such as buildings for drying, testing, and packaging, do not require application to the ALC and cannot be prohibited. So it's basically an accessory use to the main cannabis production use. Cannabis sales and services not currently permitted or legal, but uncertainty over direct farm marketing, agritourism in the future, and home-based businesses are permitted in the AOR. So with that, that's the end of my short presentation, and we're prepared to answer questions.
You covered a lot of ground there. It'd be great to have a hard copy to help us to make notes and stuff. Is that possible to get that before the meeting's over? That might be a lot to ask, but I did take a few notes, but it covered a lot of ground. So we do have at least one question. Thank you, Mr. Chu, and that is Councillor Ferguson.
Okay, Mr. Chu, thank you very much. So we're looking at this thing from multi-pronged, as you can see. I have some of my notes. So going back to, see my notes here. Going back to your chart on soil, what they can do, soil and above ground and other things. I'm not sure exact would be. Okay, yeah. The field, soil, and then the next one be July the 3rd. What is happening on July the 13th? So that was last year, right? What happened? That was when it was introduced by the federal government?
No, that was when the Land Commission basically clarified what they consider as a crop, and so that's when the use regulation came to place.
So we cannot prohibit if it's in a field. I haven't seen too many people growing, but I imagine in Delta, I think there's some. But in Langley, I don't think there's anybody. Do you know if anything is in the field, grown in the field in Langley that you're aware of?
Not that we're aware of.
But I think in Delta, I think there's some. And what about, I'm just looking at that, what about greenhouses? I'm looking at your chart. How does that apply?
So for greenhouses, we're focusing on the third and fourth bullet, or the minus sign under the second.
New cement bottling structures. Is that the greenhouse?
Mm-hmm. So we have seen some conversions or announcements of conversions. I may not be in the best position to answer questions in terms of what kind of licenses we have issued based on that date. I may have to refer my questions to my colleague here in the licensing area.
Okay, and the last kind of question, I know there'll be, I guess, more debate tonight because I think we have a notice of motion, but it's the idea to restrict or have control being a regulated community. Again, that's a complex issue, a regulated community, where some communities are not non-regulated, have more control over the others. Does that apply to area or cannabis production as well?
I'm speaking based on our look at the Delta Farm Bylaw. Delta is also a regulated municipality, and the minister has approved a farm bylaw for cannabis production. And based on what they have approved, it's simply based on setbacks and other requirements. But we can definitely consider some other aspects within a farm bylaw. We could maybe even rely on the Farm Industry Review Board. They are looking at coming up with a normal farm practice for us to consider. But in the absence of a normal farm practice, we can definitely use some examples from other farm practices, such as the audible bird scare devices farm standard, to look at what's best for us to work with the industry and work with the neighbors to basically resolve conflicts in the ALR.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I could just provide some clarification. The difference between the 4 municipalities that are regulated and all the other 100 86 municipalities in the province, is that the 4 regulated municipalities would require the approval of the minister to pass a bylaw, whereas the other ones do not. And the council can simply pass a bylaw, and if it's deemed to be in contravention of the Right to Farm Act, the Farm Practices Protection Act, then they would be subject to a process, a procedure, a legal procedure for somebody to challenge that bylaw and try and strike it down or have it struck down by a court. Whereas for the 4 regulated municipalities, we would have to have the approval of the minister before council can actually adopt such a bylaw.
So it's just a different process, considerably different, Councillor Ferguson.
Mr. Chair,
Bakken, yes?
it's very different in that it's very clear that non-regulated municipalities may only pass bylaws that are consistent with the right to farm legislation. If it's not consistent, then it may be struck down and they could start again. The 4 regulated municipalities cannot pass any bylaw unless it's approved by the minister. Now, in theory, the ministry would say, well, we may give you greater latitude in terms of the type of bylaw, whether it be restrict or prohibit. That's a theoretical construct because we can have any bylaw that we want that's passed by the minister. The minister, however, is exceedingly unlikely to pass any such bylaw if it's more restrictive than the standards they've previously approved. And in that regard, Mr. Chu, perhaps you could elaborate on the Delta bylaw, because it was a bit of an interesting situation in that Delta was looking for, I guess, some significant controls on some of these matters, but I don't believe it actually achieved that. I think it actually did some restrictions more on the periphery than it did in terms of the actual production itself.
The Delta bylaw, again, it's both focused on setbacks, and I don't think they have addressed the air emission, air quality aspect of it. Maybe I'll just have to rely on my farm bylaw expert here, the new planner, and she may be able to shed some more light on the Delta example.
All right, are you ready for us?
Yes.
You got your own microphone there too, if you wish.
Okay.
Or whatever works for you, that's fine.
Great. Thank you. Yes, so the Delta Farm Bylaw, the one that was adopted, basically what they took was just those restrictions above that were mentioned about the soil and the field-based, and that's the only kind of cannabis production that they're permitting. And I'm not sure what they asked for prior to, but Kelowna also adopted a farm bylaw with a 60-meter setback for cannabis production from residential uses adjacent to the ALR.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, we should perhaps elaborate a little on that, because there's a very good reason why Delta may wish to have passed what's effectively a provincial regulation. If there's a provincial regulation and no corresponding municipal bylaw, enforcement then is the responsibility of the province. If, however, there's a corresponding bylaw that mirrors or is very close to the provincial regulation, then the municipality would actually be able to actually enforce, which sounds interesting, except that that means that in some circumstances you may be looking at a use you would not otherwise wish to see happen. You'd be permitting it, but simply actually regulating around the edges. So in fact, you would be the de facto enforcement arm for the Ministry of Agriculture in those areas. So it has to be fairly well thought out in terms of what we attempt to achieve before we simply pass a bylaw that looks just like the provincial regulations, as all we're likely to do is to inherit the enforcement arm and nothing much else. So that's our challenge with it at this point. So from that backdrop, it's very important to maintain the distinction between regulated, non-regulated, and what that actually means in terms of what the ministry is likely to do. The ministry, in particular, as to the question was asked about, well, what about soil-based agriculture? Do we have many of them? Keep in mind that the ministry has simply said that soil-based agriculture can occur inside greenhouses, provided they do not have a concrete base. Our concern about that, of course, is to the aquifers. In some ways, we'd prefer to see it on a concrete base to deal with water runoff and all those issues. There's more systems that could be put in place, but at the present time, that's not permitted. We don't have that regulatory ability. It will simply be something that we have to, I guess, deal with to accept, because ultimately it'd be the ministry that would have to actually deal with those issues.
Yeah, pretty complex, actually. Did you want to add anything, Mr. Chu, or we have some more questions?
Sure. We actually have some additional slides, and they were prepared based on a minister bylaw standard to deal with medicinal or medical marijuana. The province had those guidelines out when before the comprehensive legalization of marijuana, because we had some growers in the province that were actually growing medical marijuana at that time. So if that helps you kind of take a look at what the province would accept as a minister standard for medicinal purposes, we can go over those slides as well.
Let me ask Council then, there's two more questions, whether they pertain to more of the retail or some of the other parts of the presentation, or if you want to get into more production questions. What is Council's wish? You had a question? Why don't we take these two questions and then we'll consider your slides. So then, Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yes, thank you. I had two my mic's on there. Thank you. I had two questions. One was with just regard to the production here that we're talking about and related to odor. And it says on the slide that's in front of us here that we cannot prohibit cannabis production in a side of a structure, such as a greenhouse, if it has a soil base. But what about the issue of odor? And lots of other farm production have odors, and we can smell the various odors from various farms. How are they? What is the are the regulations around odor as it relates to cannabis, particularly from greenhouses? And how do we as a community, or what are some options that we have available to us around odor?
I can speak to the mushroom growers. They're subject to actually a minister standard that was developed based on our experience in the area growing mushrooms. So each industry is different. For the cannabis, we're still in the process of developing a standard. I'm saying we, just basically the Farm Industry Review Board, which is a quasi-tribunal body to look at normal farm practices in the province. They have retained a knowledgeable person to develop a air quality control standard for the minister. And right at this point, we do not have a standard for the province. But we're also subject to Metro Vancouver air quality monitoring, and they're working on a cannabis monitoring standard as well.
Right. So at the present time, we can't regulate it because it's considered just normal farm practice. But you're saying that that'll come forward as we determine what is a normal expected odor from cannabis production. That'll still be coming.
Right. Well, so in a sense, we're looking at an issue where we have to deal with conflicts in the rural area. And again, based on our bird scare devices, we could look at an angle where we would require an air quality engineer to certify a particular production and specify a local contact person to resolve conflicts. These are some of the examples that we can use based on other normal farm practices and the way the ministry or the province is dealing with nuisances in other sectors of the agricultural industry.
Okay, that's helpful. I just want to then maybe just shift a bit towards retail. On one of the slides, talked about the options for us could be private or public retail sales. And so I'm assuming when we say public, we're talking about the province having their retail outlets that are run by the province. Has there been any interest by other communities, or have you seen anything where they're looking at having the municipality look at operating retail? For example, you've talked about privates. We could have private, and now we have public, which is province. Is there something where the municipality are looking at doing that, or is it simply them just saying, well, we'll allow private or we will allow provincial?
I don't believe we have a public example that's run by a local government. I think in this case we're strictly looking at the liquor and cannabis regulation branch running the public stores.
Okay, and so some communities though have allowed it to be a mix of private and public.
That's correct.
So similar to what they do with liquor. Okay, thank you.
So councillors couldn't open their own store at the moment then? Okay, next speaker it was Councillor Arneson, so I'm not sure what's happened to the gadget here, but I'm just going to manually select you there. No, I can't even do that. There we go. You're on.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions. My first one is having to do with, thank you very much, by the way, for your presentation. So the expertise that you now have based on doing all this background research about different options. So my first question is about the retail. And so I'm wondering whether or not you did a survey of model bylaws for communities that wish to have retail. So I know we know more, I think, about the provincial model, but just in terms of the criteria that were pre-selected for what the community interests might be relative to what the government was putting together.
We did a very cursory review, and information is basically summarized in the presentation, but I can recall some criteria here is mostly in the commercial areas. Like I mentioned earlier, some municipalities specify a fixed number of retail stores that they would like to see, as in the case of Abbotsford, they're considering 4 at this time, and in White Rock 1, and specifically in the commercial areas.
Just following up on that, so my understanding is that many times the criteria are having to do with within a certain radius of something, and so I understand there's probably setbacks that are fairly standardized when it comes to those things.
I think they're mostly based on the commercial zoning setbacks. Again, they're very much focused on the number and the location in terms of whether it's commercially designated or not, or zoned or not.
Okay, well, that would be helpful because I think looking at those kind of options would help to direct our minds towards what, if we wish to go in that direction, would be something that we think would be suitable for the township. So, and I guess the other thing is that I wish sometimes not to reinvent the wheel, and to know that some jurisdictions have already undertaken these kind of bylaws, and therefore we can understand now, if there's been a time lag, what's been successful and what has not maybe been so great, and so we can adopt those things. I mean, some of the things that occur to me are ways to structure the licensing so in the event that somebody becomes problematic, that you could actually have the wherewithal at the outset to stop their ability to continue to have a business license. Those kinds of things, which are more restrictive, but maybe would give some people more comfort as to the ability that we have oversight over operations.
Right.
And just, sorry, one more quick question. And just to clarify, so the degree to which this is production side, so the degree to which a farm bylaw would impact a currently existing or soon to receive permits. So at what point would our farm bylaw obviously would take some time to implement, and it would only, I assume, crystallize at the point in which the minister said that that was something that we could enact, but it wouldn't capture any retroactive operations that would otherwise be contrary to that.
There's one particular aspect, and that's focusing on the air quality aspect of it. If we were to look at the farm bylaw as a bylaw to regulate the technique of farming, and it's in this case cannabis production, we would be able to have consistent monitoring of the situation. So if we were to require an air quality management plan for a cannabis farm, then we would have to get sufficient scientific evidence that it's performing based on either the FIRB normal farm practice, Farm Industry Review Board normal farm practice, or Metro Vancouver air quality standards, or some other standards that may exist in the community. And that would be a requirement for business license renewal on an annual basis.
And just finally, I'm on the Climate Action Committee, so I know that there's public engagement that's going forward about this. What I find interesting is that their approach, rather than having to do with the odor management, is really related to the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, which are bound up actually with the odor. And so that kind of scientific measurement and what that would all look like. But once again, that's a fairly lengthy process, I assume, for them to come up with those regulations. So, thank you.
All right, we have a mess up with the machine here, so Councillor Kunst is next, but she has no microphone, so I'm going to give her mine there.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation. So currently, right now, if you are in the ALR and you have a piece of property, do you have to let anyone know that you might possibly want to grow an acre or two of marijuana? You just have to apply for a permit.
If you were to grow a field crop, you wouldn't have to apply. The bulleted list there, it's all basically considered as a use within the ALR. It's part of right to farm.
Right. Okay. So I just wanted that clarification. So if you were to apply for a license and decided you want to buy 20 acres and, put marijuana on there, anyone can do that, right?
Yes, at the provincial level, but let me backtrack a little bit. To be able to grow marijuana, I believe you would need to apply for a federal license to grow.
Okay. So do you know how many people are applying for those licenses currently?
5, according to the bill. 500. Oh.
500?
Oh.
Oh.
No, okay, what is it?
Sorry, I need.
Is it 500, Mr. Story?
Yeah, there's 500 so far from the last survey that we did. There's 500 applications in, I believe 100, there's approximately 120 across Canada that have been approved already.
Across Canada.
500 across Canada. Okay.
But in the township, how many?
Yeah. Do we know how many have applied in the township?
Not offhand. I can get that number fairly easily for you. There is a list by province of how many are out.
And we don't know where currently they might be growing as well.
List those.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. And I had a question when you talked about, what about farm gate sales? That's a whole nother thing. But I mean, if they're being grown, is there a farm gate sale ability for them?
Not at this present moment and not based on the current ALC regulation, but that may come. And that may be, one consideration if we were to consider a farm bylaw, and we would be able to exclude certain activities and purely focus on the production side of things consistent with the ALC regulation.
All right, thanks very much. And Mayor Froese, you're up next.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk mostly about the retail, but I just want to start off with the agriculture one. The air quality plan, is that required by Health? I think it's Health Canada that regulates the growing of cannabis in Canada. And is that part of their requirement as an air quality plan?
It's a part of the federal license that they need to take out before they can get into production.
So just to help me here, if they have one and then we have one, we're required, but they're required to have one anyway. So I'm just wondering why the township would want to get involved in putting it in a bylaw that really is being regulated by the federal government.
Maybe when I mentioned the requirement for, let's just say, an air quality management plan would be a condition for us to grant a business license, but not as our own requirement per se.
That helps. So on the retail, and we see a lot of other jurisdictions have made some decisions. Some yes, some no. Some are still working on it, as we are. The public consultation part of it. I know we have 7 members of council here today, and there's 9 total. And I'm sure if we sent a piece of paper around and said, "What would you like to have?" We'd probably have 7 today, or 9 different options and ideas. But really be interesting to hear from the community and what it is they would like to see with providing options. So in some of these other municipalities, have they gone to public consultation, and is it a requirement from the province prior to determining the, I guess, the scheme that we would be having, whether it's public, private, combination of both, or not at all? Just how does that part work, the public consultation?
Just based on the Abbotsford experience, I believe they've had some public consultation. But I think it's beyond a bylaw format. Should council decide to go through a rezoning process, we would be able to think about having open houses, and also the public hearing as part of the bylaw process would be considered engagement activities.
The rezoning already assumes that we're putting a zone in. We haven't asked the public whether they want it or not. We can still say no. So I'm of the thought that we need to do some pre-consultation with our residents and find out what is they would like to see, and that would help council form the direction to staff on what type of bylaw. It's and because not everybody knows the options that are in front of us and how this will impact their community. So, Burnaby has, everyone seems to have a different way of doing it. Burnaby is all provincial, 4 locations. Maple Ridge has done something similar. Others are, they see them clustered. But we, in a way, how do we gauge that from the public? And before we move on, I know we have to make a decision here at some point. So I think there's others who are interested in establishing retail locations, but without us actually coming up with what's going to be our policy or what's going to be our zoning, it's difficult for them. And if we said no, then they understand it's not going to happen. If we say yes, it's going to be in this form, then at least they know which direction to go. So what form would that look like, and is that something that we can direct staff to engage? Maybe you can help me out on that.
Well, I see engagement in kind of 2 main focus. The first group of people that we need to engage is just the general community. But within the general community, there may be consumers who may have a preference to purchase their products locally. And another group of people that we would engage is actually the farmers or the producers themselves. Just like the blueberry industry, they are almost self-regulating or self-organizing, and they have specific contact persons in the field. And we would, in that case, we would go to the producers and see if they would actually form a group to represent themselves.
On the retail sales, not the production.
That's the production
No,
and
I'm
retail.
just talking retail. We need to separate these two, because one is within our jurisdiction is the retail. The production is we're working that through. So it's almost two lines. So we need to separate retail, and I'm talking retail.
Okay.
Not agriculture as the whole. We've got ALC involved, and the province involved, and Metro Vancouver involved, and we're getting involved. But it's the retail that we got to focus on. That's the answer that we don't have. So if you could focus on that type of consultation, what other municipalities have done, and what do you see how it would be working here in Langley?
But we could do that. It's also, helpful for us to look at the policy options available, and then in that case, we may be able to provide more specific information to council. So that's the whole premise of the presentation, is to split retail from the production, although they may be overlapping in some cases. We will definitely consider some engagement options and learn from other municipalities.
Mr. Chair, if I could again apologize for the interjection, but perhaps some additional thoughts. Staff is aware that municipalities that have allowed cannabis retail in their jurisdictions have followed the various paths, including doing no consultation and just adopting a wait-and-see or monitoring approach, allowing some retail outlets to operate and then just saying we'll see how they go, to some municipalities actually going to their constituents and doing a referenda as part of their process. I know Port Moody is one of those that has actually gone to the residents and requested input specifically on cannabis retail. So I guess it would be good if council was to direct staff to go down the no side or the yes side. Then staff could present council with another report subsequently at a future meeting, at a future regular meeting of council, in terms of a proposed strategy for public engagement that would then determine the ultimate outcome in terms of the options that council is available.
Because the way I see it, you're adding, Mayor Froese, another purple oval over on the yes side would be consultation. But I think what I'm hearing is that we really don't have a decision what color flag we are in the township. I notice on the map there is a red flag no. Now, is that the township or the city?
The city of Langley.
So, and where's our flag?
We're the flag.
We have a neutral flag, do we?
We're TBD.
But we don't have any, so I guess
We do not have a
I think
specific
that's probably the
position.
decision we have to make first, is which side of the continuum are we on. All right, is that it, Mr.
Oh,
Mayor
that's
Froese?
fine. I
Okay.
just wanted to raise that and just,
Yeah.
so council can start considering how we're going to do that in whatever direction this.
So that would be another oval on the yes side, I guess, right? We have Councillor Woodward.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. I actually thought that the item was specifically related to retail, so, but I'm glad to get another overview of the production complexities, especially in regards to Farmgate. I don't really want to, I mean, just speaking for myself, I don't know if we're ready for a Circle Cannabis tour similar to a Circle Farm tour. And so I did want to highlight that it would be, I'd like to know, just while you're here, whether it's possible for us to prohibit sales on the ALR as part of the retail conversation.
That would be a test for the farm bylaw. Should council decide to go down that route, then we could basically focus on the production side and exclude some of the things that I've mentioned, like testing, quality control, R&D, and the service orientation, the edibles, the lounges, and the spas.
Yeah, so I think that's while we're focused on retail outside of the ALR, I do want to make sure that we continue to look at retail, also potentially including the ALR, potentially not having or not having, of course, each member of council have their own opinion, but potentially not having. What we essentially have in some of these wineries is basically restaurants on the ALR, with this idea that they're selling the wine of the local production, and maybe how are we going to potentially look at controlling that or not controlling that on the ALR as part of the retail conversation. And so, while we say we can regulate retail, that's technically true, of course, but in terms of the ALR, we would have to go to the provincial government for approval of preventing that if that's what we wanted to do. Yeah, so I'd like to at least float the idea that I'd like to include that as part of the retail conversation and any options that may come from staff. I think it's pretty obvious, too. I appreciate the suggestion from Mr. Seffi. That's pretty obvious that we haven't even decided a yes or a no. And I think that would be something to get down to before spending much more time on regulation and consultation, which can be part of the process if the answer is yes, and maybe start there. One of the things that, again, while you're here about the production, there is no way to get to properly, and I say properly as in quotation marks as an opinion, properly taxing cannabis production on the LR.
I don't think we have
mechanism, business licensing, any sort of requirement we can dream up that might cost a lot of money, any sort of thing that we can properly get to properly tax people, because this is a concern I have, is there's not going to be much incentive to locate cannabis production in industrial areas given land costs when you can just locate it on farmland. And so I'm concerned there's really no way to get to proper taxation of production.
I don't think we have a specific cost and benefit control here at this point, but we can definitely consider some higher business license fees to justify the administration, enforcement, and public safety aspects of a municipal organization. I believe also as part of council priority, the list that council approved earlier this year, lobbying the with UBCM for revenue sharing is one of the things on that list.
Yeah, so that's, I think, leads me to my other question, too, is that Mayor Froese raised it in regards to there's so many levels of government involved in this. And one of the things we're hearing that even if there's federal regulations, the federal government may not be caught up to date yet with enforcement. And whether or not another question for you, just high level on the production side, do we have the right to enforce federal regulations to see if we want to bear the cost to, at least for the benefit of our residents, that those regulations are actually enforced, not just on paper?
Well, this is a multi-level government issue, and I believe going back to the blueberry industry, if we were to specify a local contact person so that we can actually have a point person that we can talk to start, monitoring and resolving the conflicts locally, and we may be able to, produce more science to say that you're not conforming to an established standard, then we may be able to address an issue quicker than other levels of government.
But there was a blueberry association well in existence that we utilized and strengthened, actually. But is there such a thing for cannabis production?
No, and that's something that we can look at within a farm bylaw framework. And that's why I kept going back to the audible bird canons, because we have a local contact person requirement within that farm bylaw, and we would just go to that person to address the issues, I think, basically 24/7.
All righty. Go ahead, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for those. Councillor Woodward raised some good points there, and this is and Councillor Long, the on-farm sales. Now, I've got the bulletin from May 8th from the Agricultural Land Commission. They talk about storing, packing, preparing, and processing farm products, and it's similar to what happens now with other crops, and that at least 50% of the farm product is produced either on the agricultural land or by an association. So, but it doesn't mention sales, and so it's quiet on sales. So, has there anything been specific from the Agricultural Land Commission or the province on sales? They're silent on it, but they mentioned, well, production obviously, but storing, packing, preparing, and processing, but they don't mention sales. They're silent on it.
I don't believe we have seen anything related to sales in the ALR.
So that would be something we could put into our requested bylaw. Okay, if there's more speakers, fine. If not, maybe we could look at a motion whenever you're ready, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, do we have any more speakers? And I guess I was going to look to the committee as where it would like to proceed. Mr. Backen, do you have any suggestions too?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You may wish to consider, having a dialogue as to whether we're effectively a green light or a red light community. If we are to be green, then I think we can simply refer the matter to staff, and we can then come back with some sort of framework we think that might be feasible, and we can look at some of the points that were raised here today. If we're a red light community, then I think simply indicating
we
that.
have other issues if we're a red light community. But I don't know, Mayor Froese, would you agree that's probably not a decision we would make here, or would it be? I mean, that might.
Goes to council. So. Yeah.
It does, but so is the committee ready to do that? Okay, so you're going to make a motion, Mayor Froese?
Yeah, and I didn't write it out, so we're going to have to help. I'll need some help to wordsmith this. Basically, the intent is to send this to council, request council to refer the retail options to staff to bring back a report in the green light part, to bring back a report on the options in cannabis retail in the township of Langley. So not saying no, but saying yes. So maybe you can help me with the wording. And the intent is that, in my opinion, this is something that is here, it's coming, and I think we need to have retail in the municipality to prevent the unauthorized illegal sales, which is continuing to go on in our municipality, to give options for residents to purchase it legally. And I think by going the no route, we really aren't doing a service to residents. And I think for those that are still selling it illegally, at least we have the option to say it's legal here, and they can be dealt with.
Okay, Ms. Bauer, do you have enough for motion?
So that's the intent. I've given my. Yep. But I wanted to get a little bit of help here on just the wording. That would help staff. So
we should have something that before we call for a second as to what we're going to do.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter what it is. Councilor Woodward will second it.
So if you can help, I know Ms. Bauer is fantastic at coming up with exactly the right wording.
No pressure.
Yeah.
So we're referring the motion to council, and basically it is a referral to report for two staff to report back on options for cannabis retail in Langley.
And including consultation.
Including a consultation process.
Consultation plan.
What that would look like.
So, Your Worship, just to paraphrase, and it's really a recommendation that the committee to council that the matter be referred to staff for consideration of a cannabis regulatory scheme with the appropriate public consultation.
And hoisting a green flag. Yeah.
That's why we pay you the big bucks.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor, all right, and we can discuss it like crazy here. Go ahead, Councilor Woodward, you're next.
I just want to clarify the process. So we're referring this to another council meeting, but then it'll go to staff, or it'll just go straight to staff?
Yes. It has to go to council to refer it to staff, because the committee can only make recommendations to council.
So I just wanted to clarify then, if I don't know if this is possible, but if it's just a report, maybe we can deal with it today's meeting.
Yeah, can we put it on today's?
Is that too late to do that? If it's just a report and we're agreeing to it now, essentially.
No, the committee could request that the council consider this matter under other business, either in the afternoon or the evening.
So I would suggest that we would do that if it's just a report to staff. I just wanted to clarify that.
Policy, sorry, in procedure-wise, a member of this committee would bring that up under other business, right?
That's correct. It has to be
Even at the beginning, at the agenda approval or something like that.
correct. We should actually, the technical process would be to add to the item as to the adoption of the agenda under other business.
That would be you, Mayor Froese. Okay, all right. And yes, it was seconded, Councillor Ferguson, and Councillor Woodward has the floor. Pardon me.
Yep. So so I'm glad that we can maybe save a couple of weeks on a technicality there. I'm also glad that we're sort of finally getting to this issue and yes versus no, and I definitely want to investigate yes before fully accepting yes, but I don't really support a no. And you have a legal product that people want, people consume. I don't consume it. I don't want it, but it's a product that, like any other people, it's legal and people have it. I think we have to get on with allowing it in some form. And so I generally am glad to see we're finally heading in a direction of at least finally looking at this one way or the other. Thanks.
Okay. And Councillor Whitmarsh, you should be up. Yes.
Thank you. I'm also pleased that we're getting on with it and looking to make a decision certainly around yes or no. I guess I wanted to just ensure that when we talk about the public consultation, that the public consultation is also part of the decision-making on the yes or no, that we haven't decided yes here today and just looking for various options, but that it could actually be a no answer depending on the public feedback. But the consultation is about yes or no, not so much about just the specific options. But certainly I'm very pleased that we're moving forward and getting going.
Okay. Councillor Ferguson?
Well, yeah, I just used the word caution. I think that if it was, by the way, an excellent presentation today by Mr. Chu, and he's indicated to us the toughest part to read is the locations where they have the cannabis and the approved and the to be announced and the otherwise. If we look at the Langley City, which they've said no right now, and I think Delta, which is the regulated community, saying no, and others saying no, there's quite a few on the list that have said no, and they're probably saying no for a reason. They just wanted to proceed with some caution. And that's what I think, oh, there it is, the list. And that's why I say, we still have to look at our neighbors to both Surrey and Langley City, and Abbotsford is to be announced. And the only ones so far south of the Fraser in the metro region here is White Rock. So our similarities would indeed be Richmond, which has farmland as we do, Delta, which is farmland, and so do we do, Surrey, which has farmland, and so do, and Langley Township, which is farmland, which we have farmland. And I think that they're being cautious. I think, we indeed should be cautious as well. So I'm not one to rush into. I'm sure that we know the legislation is there, and that's a fact. I'm sure that many of these that are said no or probably will change their mind over time, but I think they're being cautious because of other challenges regarding odor, regarding farming, and regarding the number of things that were questioned during this Council Priorities Committee meeting, and also with members of Council asking staff questions about the farming area and the regulations, the regulated communities for farming and the like, and also we have a notice of motion tonight. So I'm just saying I would prefer to be more cautious, and regardless of whether it's legal or not, or it's going to come about, I think that if all these were yes, then it'd be different, but I think we should proceed with caution. So I won't supporting moving forward at this point in time. Thank you.
And I'm just wondering if we're really talking about going orange, or are we going, because that's the other color that's on here. And the question I had then, these no's, the reds, are they in a waiting period as well, perhaps, as we are, or have they actually made a motion that is no?
I think that's the case. They've made a decision not to have retail facilities in the municipalities.
By council resolution? Yeah, okay. We have Councillor Woodward again. Go ahead.
Again, I like that. Yep. So I'd like to, again, just want to confirm, I forgot to mention that if in terms of the retail, while leaning towards the yes side with with controls and regulations, that really skeptical of having it on the ALR. So in terms of, again, this hybrid approach to the retail conversation, that it would differentiate retail on the ALR and have that included within the recommendations that come back, some mechanisms to potentially control that, so maybe we don't end up with cannabis lounges on the ALR. That's kind of my point. Thank you.
All right, Mayor Froese?
I just want to reiterate, council always has that option to go with the no side if after consultation we hear a different message from residents. But I do agree we need to put something to the public. We have to at least make part of the decision, and this isn't a decision to go yes, but this is a decision to hear from the public. If it's an overwhelming no, this council will have to deal with that and decide on its own merits. But just want to give comfort to the other members of council who
And I would like to know,
concern.
Mayor Froese and Ms. Bauer, does the motion actually give that connotation? Doesn't have green in the motion? Does it have? Because I think that's an important point, that that it is not necessarily going green immediately, but that it's the consultation's a big part of it. The
motion makes no mention of yes, no, green, red, or anything like that. It's simply a report back from staff.
Okay, Councillor Kunz.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm the same. I would just have one question about public consultation, and how does that message get out to the public, and how do we get to those groups that we really want to hear from? So, business groups, youth groups, parent groups, school groups, like the people that will be most impacted by the decisions that we make about cannabis and where they can buy cannabis, and our RCMP and those sorts of groups. Like, will they get a direct invitation, or is it just going to be in the newspaper about the fact that we're doing this? So it's just a comment.
And I would think that that's the nature of the report, right? Because consultation was specifically mentioned in the motion. Mr. Bakken?
That part is accurate, Mr. Chairman. It is the case that the consultation will determine what the next steps are. I would just be cautious, though, that I think the decision to go to consultation suggests that, by implication, there's a willingness to entertain and consider this. And if council is of the mind that, regardless of that consultation, it's not appropriate, we're better to dispose of that earlier on than actually go through the process and raise expectations. I just exercise that caution.
Okay, well, that's the beauty of the CPC making a recommendation to council, because it will come back for discussion with the whole council on how we approach it from here, I guess. Any more discussion on the motion that is there? Maybe we better hear it, Ms. Bauer, so we know for sure what we're voting on.
The motion reads that Council Priorities Committee recommends that Council refer cannabis retail to staff for consideration of a regulatory scheme, including public consultation, and that Council consider this motion under other business of the May 27th, 2019 regular afternoon or evening Council meeting.
Okay, we're satisfied with that? Any more discussion? Shall we make a vote? Yes, we'll do. Do you need us to call it as a show of hands? All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Ferguson opposed. All right, that concludes the presentation and the agenda. Is that right, Mr. Bakken? There's no other items added to it, so we'll have a small break, and then council resume at 2:30.
Mr. Chairman, so that's the retail side of the equation. Should the committee wish to talk about the production side, we would benefit from the discussion as well.
You have the additional slides, then. Does council, should we hear that? Let's do that then, right? Okay. Please proceed. Thank you.
So that's basically the flow diagram that we looked at earlier. So for production, production can take place on the right-hand side. That's the industrial assumed urban area or areas, and then on the right-hand side it's the AOR. So we try to look at production that can actually happen anywhere in the township based on current legislation from senior levels of government. So if we want to just focus on the rural side, the ALR side, we've actually prepared an outline to take a look at, the flavor of a farm bylaw, if you wish, and we can go over that information. So this discussion is actually based on a Ministry of Agriculture farm bylaw standard for medical marijuana that they issued a few years back before comprehensive legalization of cannabis in Canada. So what we think here is some potential conditions for cannabis production in the ALR. This is basically trying to cascade the legislative framework that we looked at earlier. The farmer will have to comply with the various requirements coming from the very top, hold a valid license for production issued by the Government of Canada. We could consider focusing on growing and cultivation of cannabis strictly within the AOR, and then we'll have to meet the farm standards that we're expecting or forthcoming, and also meet air quality standards in Metro Vancouver. So these are basically the things from senior levels of government. And then at the bottom, we have two bullets, things that we can maybe control. We can basically limit production within an agricultural zone, or a zone that has agriculture use within the zoning, and that particular use will have to be in the LR. So, for example, in some suburban residential zone, agriculture is a permitted use, and we would not want to allow that activity to occur in a suburban residential zone. The person will also have to take out a business license from the township. Now, in terms of farm standards, these are some of the things that we basically get from the minister standards for medical marijuana production facilities. The first one is setback from the ALR, watercourses and property lines. And then the other one is setbacks from daycares, schools, parks, trails, places of worship, and hospital here in Langley. And we can also specify some buffers between a dwelling unit in the rural areas from the cannabis production site. Just like regulating other farm activities, we can also look at stormwater and wastewater management plans. These are in place for greenhouse production. We can, again, regulate air quality management and basically assign a local contact person for future issues. So these are some of the things that are in place for other farm activities, and in this case, medical marijuana. So just to give you a flavor of what a farm bylaw could do for the township based on some existing standards from the province.
Questions? Oh, yeah, Councillor Ferguson, you got a question? Go ahead.
Thank you, and again, thank you for the presentation. Again, when you see things like this, it just begs more questions. And I guess the question is, we in the township have many diverse by lot sizes, anywhere half acre, quarter acre, of course, 1 acre, and 4.2, 5, 10, and the list goes on. What are people allowed to grow on their own property personally?
I believe the federal limit is 4 plants per household.
Yeah, and I know we probably don't have, I see some of the bylaw folks are here, or past bylaw folks are here. We don't have a bylaw team to go around checking to see if somebody's got 4 or 5 plants and things like that. So I mean, that's a federal rule that they have, and because we have the type of community, I mean, it would be, I guess easy for folks to grow more than that because of the size of some of the lots. Anyway, I was just wondering about that. The main thing is on this particular, do people have to have a license to grow it on an open field as well?
I believe so.
And how difficult are those licenses to get? It's hard to know. Do you know? Does anybody know?
I don't think we've
That's
seen
why
any
there's
at this
500
point.
being applied for now?
Yes, but it'll depend on what you're talking about, whether it's commercial or whether it's the medical side, right? The medical side, as of April 1st of 2014, when they were going to disband them and go to commercial, the RCMP went through Health Canada, and there were 649 licenses issued in the township for personal production. And so those numbers have changed. Some have gone out of business and some have decided not to grow anymore. But there's a substantial amount within the township, and most of those are in residential areas.
So they're kind of out there in limbo, or they're still registered or still permitted?
They're still registered. They don't need to renew their license because of the court challenge. The Health Canada said as long as you have a valid license, you can continue growing for as long as you want.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Backen, did you want to say
Mr.
something?
Chair, just a comment that might help put it in perspective. The reason for this is, I think, to show what can be done, but which by implication shows what cannot be done. And the best way to think of some of these restrictions are, these are really much more analogous to a development permit where it's form, character, and siting. You're looking at some broad strokes that actually deals with the site itself, but not the actual use or the production on the site itself. So the province is keen, I think, to see that there is production and that the use is permitted, but the municipalities that are non-regulated have, if you will, the ability to enter into discussions which are very much like form, character, and siting. The township would be able to do so as well once the minister approves our guidelines in terms of what this would look like. But that may be very different than what you're hearing people asking for. I mean, and certainly in some of these locations. So just a word of caution that our ability to regulate is exceptionally limited compared to what people may be asking.
Okay.
Do we know of any facilities, if they didn't follow those bylaws, that they got shut down? Has that actually happened?
I would have to look at Mr. Story for that.
Are you talking about our bylaws or the...
Any in the province where if they're not following even medical marijuana in the past, which they've been...
Well, they wouldn't be shut down. They'd simply be brought into compliance. So if their setback was 55 meters instead of 60 meters, was it meters, Jason, or feet? Meters? Meters. I mean, they would simply have to pull their operation back by those 5 meters. It's really not a red light shutdown situation. It's adjust your structure, adjust your siting, adjust your form and character to meet the requirements of the bylaw.
Froze?
Yeah, thanks. So, just reading the ALC bulletin from May 8th. Of course, it's always a little bit confusing because they state very clearly, and I think the province will be relying on the Agricultural Land Commission's regulations, and it basically says it may not be prohibited if it's outdoors or inside a structure that we've already talked about the type of structure. So municipalities, local governments may regulate or prohibit certain kinds of cannabis production, though may not prohibit all forms of cannabis production. According to this, we cannot prohibit if it's soil-based or before July 13th. Then it goes on to say that Section 4 of the ALR use regulation provides the farm uses referred to in this part, which includes Section 8, which is that part about soil-based, may not be prohibited by a local government enactment except by bylaw under Section 552 of the Local Government Act, or by First Nation. So so we can have a bylaw under Section 552. Let's take Chilliwack. So Chilliwack could make a bylaw under Section 552 prohibiting all cannabis production in the ALR, or because it says here their uses referred to may not be prohibited except by a bylaw. Yeah. So they're allowed to do it, and we need to get signed off on that. Is that correct?
Effectively. So Chilliwack would have the difficulty if they passed a bylaw, being a non-regulated community, that prohibited cannabis production. That bylaw would stand until overturned by a court. That's where it would begin. So if they instead said Chilliwack will pass a bylaw that says that you may only 5% of the agricultural land reserve may be used for cannabis production, that would stand and probably could not be overturned by a court. It would take a ministerial order, only because the court would be lacking jurisdiction to make the determination if there was not a prohibition. Our situation is a bit more difficult in that we, in theory, could actually pass a bylaw that said prohibition. It would not be valid. It would not have any force and effect until approved by the minister. The minister, in theory, could enforce that, could authorize us to have that prohibition. So that's why it's argued that farm bylaws are superior to municipal bylaws. But it's a bit of an illogical, it's a circular reasoning, because the minister would not go to all this trouble to pass a bylaw that contravenes what they seek to achieve. So while theoretically it exists, it's not going to be something we can do. So our bylaw would have no force and effect till adopted, and such adoption by the minister is virtually impossible.
So in other words, we could create a bylaw that provided some framework, not prohibiting it totally, but restricting it to certain areas of the municipality.
Well, whereas another municipality could do just that and would have a high likelihood of not being overturned by a court, the bylaw you've described would have to be endorsed by the minister.
Right,
and Mr. Chu's presentation here outlines what they have approved before, and what they've approved before is exceptionally limited in terms of the municipal jurisdiction. And it was a good question. Maybe the setbacks would not be 60 meters, it would be 55 meters. The point being, though, that's a small difference, and no operation would be precluded from operating. They'd simply have to adjust their operations. Again, it emphasizes that our ability to influence, I won't even say regulate, influence is exceptionally limited.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Arneson.
Yes, thank you. I'm just looking at these options, and I know they're not exhaustive, so you've got some potential farm standards, and a lot of them just seem sort of generic in the sense that they come from somewhere, and we know that we could rely on them likely because they are somewhat limited, I guess. My concern about this overall is that although I'm really in support of having some kind of standards we can enforce at the local government level, that we are allowing people to believe that we're going in a direction that's going to potentially create a very minimal or no result at all relative to the kind of things that we hear about as complaints. So, I mean, there's other things that aren't on the list, like light pollution, and I know it addresses water, but to me it's somewhat analogous of the city of Surrey. So they wanted to regulate and have a tree bylaw in the ALR. So it's more or less a management plan that they can effect, and then they allow the local government to oversee that. But to me, unless we had something that had an awful lot more scope of authority potentially here, I guess I'm a bit dubious. I guess it's better than nothing, but it's going to be an awful lot of effort to try and sell this to the ministry. I assume that every other comment that they've made is that they're really in favor of it as an allowable use as much across the board as is possible. So that's the impression that I'm getting. And so to go counter to that with having potentially a minimal result and raising public expectations, I think could be problematic. I think it could kind of come back to bite us in that sense. But for no other reason, because I do agree that local governments should have jurisdiction over trying to manage zoning and uses of property, but it seems that's a conundrum that we're in, so I just wanted to point that out from, that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any more discussion from council? From the committee, I should say. Mr. Bakken, anything to add? Mr. Chu? Mr. Saifi? All right, then someone will have to adjourn because Davis ain't here.
Motion to terminate.
Okay, move that side of the table. Seconded by Councilor Whitmarsh. All in favor, opposed? Carried. Thank you very much, and thanks to staff for your presentation and your time. Thank you.